The first one was in May, and it was Saliman and the Memory Stone. And that's Apples and Honey. And the illustrator is Yanan Patia. And how that came about was I had been familiar for years. I'd heard the story about the Yemenite Jews. I have a lot of friends of Jewish Yemenite heritage. And I knew the story of the Operation Magic Carpet, which was like 1949 to 1950, and 49,000 Jews were rescued from Yemen. But I had been talking to a friend in Israel, Ayala, and she mentioned almost offhand in this casual way, oh, there was that time when my family walked from Yemen in 1881 to Israel. And I stopped her there and said, wait, what? And I'd never heard this or anything really like this at all. So it was a group of Jews, a small group of Jews that walked, many small groups of Jews that walked in 1881. It was for spiritual reasons, a kind of messianic. A rabbi interpreted one phrase, go forth on a date palm, and used gematria, and decided that was the year that they had to leave and that they were meant to go. So these families walked, and it's a really arduous journey, and it was difficult because I had to adapt it for children and make it a way that children can understand it. Hint at the hardships that they faced without really making it too horrific, because there are really a lot of really horrible things that did happen to this group of people. And very few, I think only about 200 made it. But I was really happy to be able to represent that story, and also in an honest way, though soft but honest way. The next book that came out was On a Chariot of Fire, and that was with Levine Carrito, and Siona Benjamin is my illustrator. And that one was a bit unusual because Siona and I actually pitched our story together. So we've been friends for a long time. I ran a magazine, Asian Jewish Life, for many years, and Siona was one of the first people that I had interviewed. I'd been following her work for a long time, and this is back to 2009. And so we both were familiar with each other's work, her from journalism on my end and me fine art for her. And one day when I got more serious about Kidlit, I was reading through, I guess, book descriptions for that year. And all of a sudden I see her name, and I called her up, and it was the same year that Alone Together on Dan Street came out. So I guess it was 2022. And I called her up and said to her, Siona, wait a minute, you didn't tell me you were doing children's books. And she looked and said, you didn't tell me you were doing children's books. And we always wanted to do more work together. We had a book for adults come out together, a nonfiction, just the year before that. And she said, we must write a children's book together. And that's how that came about. So we made a list of topics that we wanted to write about. And this was the one that I said we had to start with. It's the origin story of her community, and it's an incredible story. So I knew that we were going to start with that one. So we did that and pitched together, which is, again, a bit unusual, but definitely a different experience. I always think that people always say that this was done in an atypical way, or this is not, a typical story about how somebody became agented. But I think there is no typical story is what it comes down to. And everybody has a strange path of their own. So that was a strange path, but it happens, and it was a great experience. And then right after that, the next week was Mixed Up Mooncakes, and that's with Quilltree. And it was co-authored with my friend Christina Matua, and is illustrated by Tracy Subisak. And Christina and I are friends from SCBWI Hong Kong. And we wanted to make a story about a child that was of mixed heritage, where both of our families are mixed in different ways. And we brainstormed, and this is the idea that we decided to start with. It was great. The festivals fall on the same night many years, so it's like a natural way to talk about what it means to be mixed, when literally it's in one night, both of your sort of identities merge. I've been writing for adults for a long time, and sort of everything from luxury market to really focused on Asian Jewish heritage, and sort of everything in between. And I knew that I had a novel in me. I still do, which is not in a market yet, but I knew that I had a novel in me. And I started playing with ideas, and I always, in the back of my mind, I knew that I was going to sit down and write a book on my own. And I ended up closing my magazine after many years. I was the editor. I did the grant writing. I did the distribution. I did really everything. And it became really more than a full-time job, and it was difficult to manage. I ended up closing that. And I realized that I had all this research that I had been doing for 9 years for the magazine. And I knew my novel was going to come out of that, which means it would be definitely something from the Asian Jewish heritage. And I sat down and started writing a novel, and then the pandemic hit. And I realized quickly on that my novel voice was actually children's voice, and it was middle grade is what my novels, anything I've started really comes out in middle grade. And then the pandemic hit. So I sat down and started trying to write my novel. I have 5 children. We were in a small apartment in Hong Kong for the better part of 2 years. So writing a novel and editing a novel was difficult. And I ended up writing a picture book about the pandemic instead. I should probably back up because about a few years before that, I knew that I was going to write a children's book. And I joined SCBWI here and I started reading children's books purposefully. I've been reading them to my children for many years, but I started reading them purposefully, focusing on the kinds of books that I wanted to write. Um, and I attended a couple of SCBWI conferences and I got more involved with my group here. I joined a critique group. And that sort of all led up to that point where I sat down to write this picture book. So I've been living in Hong Kong for 22 years. But funny enough, it was also my father's base for business when I was growing up. In many ways, like all roads led back to here for me. And again, just living here 22 years and being familiar with the history of the region. And I covered through the magazine, and I'm also the chair of the Hong Kong Jewish Historical Society. I established myself as a quasi-expert in the Jews of China and the Jews of India, again, after 20 years of doing this. And then also, I'm also raising Chinese Jewish children too. So on top of that. But I think that it's also the idea of growing up and not really seeing myself, I'm not Chinese, but not seeing myself represented in children's books at all. And the desire to create that for myself as a child and also for my children as well is where the focus comes from. Yeah, sure. So I think something about the footnote comment too. It stems from I've been reading this article. This is again probably 20 years ago, an article about this group of American a group of American Jews that stumble upon a footnote in a book about the Jews of Kaifeng. And first of all, and then they then book flights. I mean, this book flights and go to Kaifeng, and they discovered the Jews of Kaifeng. So I always think the idea of discovering a people is funny because they were people living in a culture and a community. They weren't discovered; they were living their lives. So I thought that sort of struck me as a funny kind of comment. So I think to me, again, the footnotes is just any lesser known community or lesser known history, particularly in America and in North America and in, I guess, the Western world. But my research process, it's difficult because it's over, again, probably 20 years of research. I had people say to me when my books came out this year for On a Chariot of Fire, people said to me, you must have done so much research for this book. And I think it goes to almost that, there's that quote, I'm going to quote it, but it only took me 20 years to become an overnight success. I think it's like that, right? Like I didn't research so much for this specific book because I had been doing the research for this specific book for so long and just waiting to use these materials that I have in my head, that I have in files, that I have on my computer. For most of my books, the research, again, has been an ongoing process for a long time. The Yemenite book is very different in that I really had to purposefully research just for that. In fact, I've done more research for that specific book than any of the other books that I've written, including a novel in progress that I have. But because I really knew nothing about the Jews of Yemen. I knew my friends, I knew some customs, I knew some basic foods, but very little about the history. It took a lot. I had to go and first find academic articles, books. Usually they were out of print books. Again, this is a story of 200 people that probably completed this journey. So there's not a lot written about that. Record keeping wasn't really great. And I also consulted experts. Anybody that I met that was an expert in Jewish history, I went to parties, I went to conferences and said, I need experts in Yemenite Jewry. And finally, people led me contact after contact to a few people that really could help me get the background that I needed to understand this. I looked at files, photos online, and I watched video after video of Yemenite, sort of traditional Yemenite cooking, traditional Yemenite Jewish singing, dancing, poetry. So I really did more research on this book than I have for anything else that I've done. So that's probably my atypical research, was that one. I think that really, because the other books, again, it's an ongoing process where I've been doing this research for years. I think that for me, it's the amount of research you need to do for one tiny detail in a picture book, which nobody would even, all together, all these details make the book feel authentic. It works and you need it, but nobody's going to pick out this one line. I have one line where it says, I think it's about the women dancing, the women singing on one side of the camp, and Jad recites poetry on the men's side. And I think that if anyone else reads that, they're going to think, okay, that's a nice one line, kind of a throwaway thing. I put it in there. I probably did 6 hours of research to understand what the poetry was and the importance of poetry and the singing, and listen to the women singing, and then to try to find one line that kind of represents what that singing was and what that or is like, and for some people, and also the importance of that. So I think it's just like these tiny details and things like this. I talk about silver jewelry, silver bangles jingling, silver jewelry jingling. And same thing, the amount of work and research that has to go into these tiny details that all add up and are important in story. But I think it surprised me how much work one line and one detail take. So with all of my books, I try to convey the idea that I understand and I know that children are smart. We can't trick them. We can't fool them. But I do think that we do need to be honest with them. But again, because they are children, I think that you have to not sugarcoat things, but be able to present things in a softer and gentler way. I think it's the idea of alluding to these things without describing them in detail and all the horrific details that really came with them. I've run exhibitions in Hong Kong for schools on the Jews of Shanghai. So again, they had escaped the Holocaust, gone to Shanghai, and also had considerable hardships and left the horrors of the Holocaust. And I think that probably helped me with this skill. Again, it's still a developing skill, but I had to put these exhibitions together and talk to children about the Holocaust that had never, local children in Hong Kong that had never heard of the Holocaust, and be able to explain it to them in a way, again, that's honest, not give them nightmares and have them run out from the exhibition, and keep them there and want them to understand more and ask the right kinds of questions. So I think it was using those same kind of tools that I had for explaining things like the Holocaust in Shanghai and the deprivations there and immigration and those stories. So I think in the same sort of way, given Ruby these two holidays that she needs to come up with her own solution about how to merge them, I think it's, again, tackling it head on. And for her, I think, particularly when I'm representing mixed identities in a contemporary story, I think it's also the idea of capturing the thought that, this is joy and this should be joyful. And while you have these two identities and they might be difficult at sometimes to understand how they fit together, but I think that sort of at the end, bringing together that it is just joy, and it just makes things even better to have this color and these multiple identities in your life. I think that for me, again, it's a little bit different writing picture books than I think it is writing for like YA. So I'm the only time I get to really speak to my children readers. I speak to the grown up readers more online and on social media, and I get emails. And I think that one thing to have these books where immediately the books are out in the world, and I'm getting these emails from parents, from mothers and fathers, about how much these stories really touch their children and how their children and they were able to relate to them. And I think back, particularly with Jen Yu and the Snake, which came out about a year and a half ago. And that one in particular, I really received a strong response from readers saying, I can't believe it. Here's a book and it's Chinese and Jewish, and my children are Chinese and Jewish, or I'm Chinese and Jewish, or I'm Chinese, or I'm Jewish and Japanese. And all these responses from people that just really connected with the idea that I brought this together in one book. And in that book in particular, I took a story that wasn't Chinese at all, and I took from the Talmud. So it would have taken place, I think, probably about the year 50 in, I think, the city of Lod in Israel, in modern day Israel. And I took that and reset it in China, and in Kaifeng, within a Jewish community. And for the purpose of children really being able to see themselves in a story. And I think that when it comes to Jewish texts, I wanted children to understand that there's no one way of being Jewish. There's no one way of looking Jewish. There's no one place where Jews are from today. We're from all over. And I hope that by setting a story from the Talmud into China, that it gives children an opportunity to understand that it's their story. It belongs to them, no matter what they look like and no matter where they're from. So I don't know if that answered the question or not. I think, again, I have less of an opportunity to interact with children who are my actual target readers. I think that once in a while I'll walk into a classroom and you'll just have one kid that just jumps up and screams, especially in particularly non-Jewish schools, and screams, I'm Jewish too, or I celebrate Passover. And it's really just a really beautiful moment. I just did a school visit the other day. Again, most of the children were Chinese, so it's not the same sort of excitement to expect that stories are going to be Chinese, but it's those moments when somebody jumps up and screams, I'm Jewish, and I celebrate Passover. And I think it's that feeling that every child gets when they see part of themselves represented in a book. I always say part of why I make the books that I make is, again, for my own children who are, again, Jewish and Chinese, but also for myself. I come from a mixed background myself, too. I'm part Persian, Hungarian, Ukrainian, Russian, and I always thought when I was a child, like, where's that book about that child? And even just Jewish books when I was children. There weren't that many Jewish sort of mainstream books available at all. I read Judy Blume, but aside from that, there really wasn't very much that I can think of. The excitement of being able to bring that to children is really exciting, and having them respond to that. So. I'm part of a women's learning group with my synagogue. And one of the things we do every year on Simchat Torah is we go over Bereshit. So we go and we split it up, and you present single parsha, single passage. And we're doing the same thing, I don't know, maybe 9 years in a row, which I think actually that's how Jewish text, the beauty of Jewish text is that you're meant to be able to read it, taking who you are today to it, and it's supposed to read differently each time you read it. And I one year I would say got stuck with, you have to sign up for the part you want. And I got stuck with this one section that just has these names, and each name you're stumbling on all the names and wondering, why is this even in here? And I have to go and present it and present something interesting that I learned from it. And I remember sitting with it and thinking, okay, I've got this Naama, and she's got these brothers, and these names are all odd, and there's so many names, and why are they even in this section? And I just started thinking about it and just playing with it. And that's actually how the book came about. So it was the idea that Naama is later in Midrash, Naama in Genesis is later seen from Midrash, is explained that becomes Noah's wife. And so I took that idea. She has in this section, she has these three brothers, one that invents basically music, one that invents sort of animal husbandry, and the other one that invents tools. And I thought, if you're the sister who has these three brothers who are literally geniuses, who have created every tool that modern man needs, you've got to be pretty smart too, probably smarter than your brothers in my head. So I just played with it and had fun, just imagined what she was really like. We never really hear about her. In fact, in the story of Noah, we hear that he took his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, and we didn't even hear her name. So I just imagined who she was and what her story would be like if we were able to hear women's stories from that period. I had a lot of fun with it too. Things like I had to call up my rabbi and I said, is it okay if I have God speak to Naama and like actually have a line of God speaking to her? And he's like, what are we talking about? And now he knows when I ask a question. I said, it's for a picture book. He's like, okay. He said, what's the line? I said, I want God to say to him, Naama, I'm counting on you. I said, because a number themed STEM book. And he just said, no one's going to take this as that you're saying that this is actually God's word. Go for it. Have fun. So anytime I ask a question now, they assume that's where it's coming from. That's what Midrash is, though, right? It's reinterpretations of the text. Will mine catch on where Naama is a STEM engineering and a mathematical genius? I don't know. I was working on this novel. Again, I've been publishing for adults for years, magazine articles, nonfiction books, poetry. But with Kidlit, I was sitting down, I was going to write the novel, the pandemic hits. I never considered myself a picture book writer. I was in this critique group, and I would just say, okay, I read picture books, but I'm not a picture book writer. I'm a novelist. And when I wrote this one, I have a friend who really established herself as a picture book writer in my group here. And I called her up and I said, I think I wrote a picture book. And I sent her the text and she's like, you did it. You wrote a picture book. And I sent that off. So it was a lot of timing. Again, it was something that Apples and Honey, I'm really grateful, because just getting that first yes is everything. And so they took a chance on me, a pandemic book, which I don't know that people were ready to talk about the pandemic or hear about the pandemic. I had never published in Kidlit before. So that was really incredible. I then started to think about querying, really. I had queried a couple times, only 5 or 6 small groups of agents on novel projects, but I have a lot of funny stories about my mishaps and things I learned from that. But I started to try to query on picture books. And I only sent a couple out, and then I finished my novel and started querying on that. And I found that was easier to get a response from. But I learned a lot about picture book querying too. I learned, which I didn't know, maybe it seems obvious to other people that have done more research in this, but that you need to have other picture books that are really polished and ready to go. And I didn't really appreciate that. They'd say, okay, this is okay. And you already have a contract on this. So what are you showing me? And then I would realize I didn't have anything at that point, and I had to write more. I started querying on a novel that I'd completed. It hasn't sold yet, but actually that's what I ultimately signed with my agent on, was a novel, not on the picture books. And during the course of those early conversations, I mentioned, by the way, at that point I had 2 picture books under contract and a third was under discussion. I think under negotiation stage at that point so that would have been Genuine the Snake. The first Naama was already signed, and Alone Together and Dance Street was already signed. I brought all of those picture books in various stages along with me, but like signed for a middle grade novel. I still do. My agent's great. I love my agent. I think that there's lists and lists of publishers, and I've found them online. I've shared them with people that will take books unagented. So again, I sold really my first three books. My agent finalized the contract on the third one without an agent. They were all to Jewish publishers. I do think that for certain publishers, you do need an agent. For sure, the big five, you need an agent. And I think there's a lot of other publishers that you also need an agent. And it's just another level of gatekeeping. And I understand why gatekeeping happens in the industry, but you definitely can have a full career in Kidlit without an agent. It just depends on what you want and the vision of where you see your books going. And it's not better or worse. I think the big publishers are great in many ways, and I think the small publishers are great in many ways. So it's really what you want for your books and where you see your books. I want to write books that are for mainstream audiences that get into the big five and are in the big five. And I also want to write books that are really specifically Jewish and really are Jewish stories for Jewish children. I have my books are spread over 5 publishers now, and each for different reasons. Other people it doesn't make sense to, but I think that they're all different enough that this really works for me. And so it's just depending on where you see yourself in the market and what kind of books you really want to write. So with Alone Together on Dan Street, again, it was a pandemic book, so I knew it was time sensitive. And it was making these same lists of publishers that I was thinking, of agents. And I was still thinking that I wanted to go the agent route. But I did have a book that I didn't have time. So whoever was going to take me seriously and consider it was who I was really going to be interested in talking to. I couldn't wait 3 years. I mean, people can query for years and years before they find the right person. And I couldn't wait 3 to 4 years. My book, I think it's still relevant. I think it has themes of loneliness, of togetherness, of community that transcend the pandemic itself. But there is a certain element of it that was time sensitive. So with that one, I sent it out. I got a response rather quickly. It was Apples and Honey, and they knew that they needed to move rather quickly on it as well. I think it's an anomaly for all of my books and how fast it really did come out from the time I started querying to the time I was holding the book in my hands. I think it was about 1 year. So that wasn't really, so it was a no-brainer. I didn't have time to stop and say. I started reading online all of these, reading other people's blogs. And one thing I love about the Kidlit community is people are so generous with the information they have, their time. So I started reading about these, I guess a trick, I don't know if it's a trick, where you write to an agent and say, I have these 2 contracts in my hand. So I tried that with my first 2 books. It did not work. What I've also found is if you've already have the contract in your hand, it's really hard to negotiate at that point. I also think that I had 2 contracts in my hand for Jewish publishers. It's going to be a certain type of agent that wants to work with that and or can see that there's more, that I have a whole career out there. It's not just these 2 books. So that trick didn't work for me. I tried that again later also with my novel, saying, and by the way, and I thought that this would move the needle. Here's my novel, and I had these 2 contracts, and it didn't help me. That's one thing. Querying, I believe in targeted querying. I never did. I know other people that did these blanketed and have these stats of that they sent out 100 and something queries. I never did that. I queried a few times on projects over about maybe a 5-year time period. I don't remember exactly the timeline, but each time I was only sending out about 5 to 10 queries to agents. I really did a lot of research. Again, I love research. So I can get lost in research on any project about who was really the best people for that project. And I was always able to get feedback straight away. So I know that a lot of times, and I think, again, if you're just sending out 100 queries to people that aren't the right fit for that project at all, they're not going to respond to you. So I almost always got responses. They were almost always negative. Actually, they were always negative in the beginning, but I got responses. So something that I was doing was at least the work that I was bringing was matching the person that I wanted to be reading it. Again, a lot of pitfalls, things like, what you shouldn't do is the first thing I queried on. I did that NaNoWriMo, the National Novel Writing Month. So I wrote a whole novel, which I'd never done in my life. And I wrote 50,000 words. And that's an incredible achievement. I really mean that's an incredible achievement. I finished writing. I was like, this is incredible. I am an author now. And then I queried literally 3 days later. And my story idea, I think, was good. My title, I think, was good. They were good. The writing was terrible. And as soon as people read a page actually, I think maybe the first page might have been okay. As soon as someone got to page 2, I think they were like, oh gosh, or if they asked for my work, then it was 100% a no. And yeah, of course it was a no. It was awful. It was a good title. So again, I learned a lot, but I think that the real key is really do your research and work on on your craft. It's great. 50,000 words is incredible. It is an achievement, but it's probably not 50,000 great words. So I think that work on your manuscript, worked on craft, and working on craft is reading. It's reading other people's work. It's being critiqued by other writers. There's a lot that goes into that. And then also understand the market. And I think understanding the market and understanding what agents you would fit with, aim high, but still aim for the right people. Don't just take an agent because they're a top selling agent and you want to be with that agent because they're a top seller. Take an agent who you think your work's going to resonate with. And that's who you should really target, I think, your work and send it out to that. So I've always done small targeted queries. So I started again, I had only sent this out to the middle grade novel, which still will hopefully will sell. Maybe this year it's that. Maybe this year is the year for it. I do think that with the novel, again, I didn't have a huge number of picture books to send out, and I kept on finding myself in a position where when I did get a response from agents, they'd say, "Okay, this is okay, but what else do you have?" And I realized I didn't have much else polished. I had been really working on the novel. I really loved my novel. It's really still a story that I really want out there, and I will find a way to get this story out there. And so I started at the same time I was querying on picture books. Again, targeted, I was querying different agents on the novel. And I got one agent who was really lovely. I spoke to her, I got the call, and I don't know, I had a feeling that she wasn't right for me. And it's a really difficult position to be in, but I think that you have to weigh a lot of things when you're doing it, but to say no to somebody when you don't have another option. And I really didn't have another option at that point, but I just had a feeling that I could continue going on publishing without an agent and wait until I found the right agent. So again, it's really that targeted approach. And I actually had a woman on Twitter who was actually Muslim, and we've been chatting once in a while online, and she saw a thing for Karen Wiseman from Andrea Brown call out looking specifically for middle grade Jewish stories. And I had mentioned to this woman online that was working on a middle grade Jewish story. And she said to me, "Look at this. I just saw this today and I thought of you and I think you should query her." And I thought to myself, I don't really have a chance. But again, I have nothing to lose. I just turned down another opportunity. I knew that I could still keep on going with my Jewish books, with sort of in a circuit of Jewish publishers. But it's not easy. Querying isn't easy. And even once you have an agent, it's not easy to get a book out there. But I knew that I can continue on my own with the picture books. But I knew with a novel, it was going to be much more difficult to send novels out on your own. I sent it, and it was actually a pretty quick process with Karen once I sent it to her, surprisingly quick. So, yeah, it was great. And we had the call, and she really understood my story and saw my story, and really it resonated with her personally. And so I knew that was really the right person for me. So, again, I did sell a fair number of manuscripts to publishers in a short period of time. Like that, I am amazed. I am grateful. I haven't sold a manuscript since October 7th, since right before October 7th. And have I not written a book that's good since in the past 400 and plus days? Sure, it's possible. What I do know also is that from my agent that we've gotten responses like, again, from a Big Five publisher on a very Jewish book that has nothing to do with the conflict and nothing to do with Israel and nothing to do with all of these things that people are saying are the problem, Zionism. It was nothing to do with any of these things. It was a Soviet Union story from the 1970s. And we had a publisher say, it's not the right time for a book like this. And she wasn't going to say Jewish, but that's what this means, like this. So, if I'm experiencing that, I would assume that everybody's experiencing the same kinds of things. And whether they're hearing it or not, I think that for the most part, it just comes as rejection. Right now, you keep on seeing deal announcements on Jewish books. But I think that we're going to have a couple of years where there's not going to be very many Jewish books out in the world. And we're going to really be relying on the Jewish publishers who are already overwhelmed, and also on things like PJ Library, which also is inundated with everyone really realizes they have a Jewish story to tell. They realize the importance of telling their Jewish stories. So it's great. It's generating so many more stories. But we don't have the outlets for them right now. It's going to be hard, but I think that the only thing you can do is keep on writing, keep on querying, and keep on saving those stories, because there's going to be another side of this. We're going to come out on the other side, and it will be harder. I think it's harder now, and it's going to keep on getting harder to get these stories out there. But you're not going to see your story published if you don't write your story. So I think that I keep on writing. I have days when I want to give up too, and I can't. I just have to keep on writing the stories. And so again, when I said in the beginning that I was talking to these agents and they were saying, what else do you have? And I said, nothing. Nobody's going to be able to say I don't have anything. We're going to have a stockpile of really beautiful Jewish stories that the world needs to see. So I just keep on writing is all I can say. I have to tell myself that and remind myself that many days too. It's always funny because whenever I go to schools, kids always say, what book are you most excited about? And it's always the one that just came out or the one that's coming out next or what you're working on. So it's always, but I'm really excited about this book. First of all, I can't think of there's certainly not another Hong Kong Jewish book. There's very few books about Hong Kong, picture books about Hong Kong in general, maybe a couple of travelogue type stories. But so to be able to bring a Hong Kong book about Hong Kong history out is really exciting to me. Even more exciting, my illustrator, Bonnie Peng, is from Hong Kong also. Like she lives in Hong Kong. She's a Hong Kong artist. I haven't spoken to her. I've been liking her stuff on Instagram, so she knows who I am. I know who she is. I can't wait to meet her and hopefully be able to go to schools together. I look at the spreads and I'm writing about Hong Kong in a way that's really authentic. I'm here. It's history that I know. And she's illustrating from the same perspective, from her own perspective. And so these illustrations, the spreads from Hong Kong are incredible. I always pick one picture of from each book to blow up on my wall. And I already know which one, and then I go back and forth. But I think I know which one for that one. It's a whole spread of the Hong Kong harbor. It's a refugee story. Again, I would say it's hard, but I always say that I don't want to write a Holocaust book, but it's a book about Jews that escape the Holocaust and go to Shanghai. A little girl, it's a historical fiction, but it's very much sticks to the historical record. So she goes from Vienna to Shanghai. She stays there for the war. And then she's on a ship, which was a real ship of real people that comes to Hong Kong. It was supposed to stay just for 2 days. And then they were going to be sent to Australia from there on another ship. And the Australian ship that was meant to take this group of Jews ends up being recommissioned to move troops instead. So this group of Jews that was supposed to be in Hong Kong for really 2 days, there were no visas in Hong Kong. They end up being stranded in Hong Kong for up to 9 months. So it's a story about that little girl. There were other children. I didn't use the actual real children in it. Again, I think that when you're writing a picture book, sometimes you need to manipulate things like age. I needed a child that was going to be the right age for the book. I wanted to start it out as an infant and go through the story. So there was too many things that I would need to manipulate, and I couldn't do that with somebody's actual story. So all the dates and everything else are historical. Just the child itself is fictional. So each spread is a different year in her life, or each page is a different year in her life, beginning from when she's a baby until it ends when she's 10 years old in Hong Kong. 3 more that are not announced. Again, they're all Jewish and Chinese and Indian. So I'm really excited about those too. So one is very historical and the other 2 are not. So I think that everybody has a story to tell and everyone has a story to share. And tell your story and find a way, whatever medium it is, whether it's writing an article about your story, whether it's creating art about your story. I think that your story matters and your story should be out there. So I hope that by covering so many sort of different children's stories that I'm representing that idea, and that it will inspire people to really learn about their own stories, learn about who they are, and also share those stories too. So I guess my website, so it's Erica-Lyons or Instagram. And then from Instagram, you can get to my website. I'm using Instagram more and more. And also I was going to also just give one more small shout out to Judith Magazine. And that's on Substack. So it's a new magazine, particularly it was made for this moment in time to elevate Jewish stories and Jewish voices and also spread Jewish joy. So it's a new online magazine, the Kidlit editor. There's also a nonfiction section for adult nonfiction, adult fiction, and poetry, and then also one-to-one features. And it's a great magazine. Check it out. I'm the Kidlit editor, and I'm picking one story, one Jewish story a week to spotlight with either an excerpt or sample pages for picture books. So I would look at that, and from there, that can also get you to my work as well. I don't know the secret because I think some days I'm doing it all poorly. And I also have 5 children, right? And I'm involved in a large number of organizations. So I think on a lot of days I'm doing none of it, but just spreading myself thinner and thinner. No, but I think that I say that jokingly. I think that there's a thread that runs through all of it. And the thread is story and the thread is Jewish narrative. And I see it all as one thing in an odd sort of way. And it's just that sharing Jewish stories, and that the most powerful thing that we have is narrative as a people. We have this one singular narrative that we all share that's common to all of us. And then we have all these sort of smaller branches and specific stories that tell our own story. But it's this one compelling narrative that sort of holds everything together. So I think of myself and my work and everything and all these other things that I'm doing is all part of the same thing. So like mission driven on this just narrative, Jewish narrative. Thank you for having me.